Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Kind Mind podcast. I'm Todd. Today we have a special dialogue, and I've invited a special guest. His name is Dr. Mark Hatala, who is a cognitive scientist and a professor at Truman State University, where he's taught since 1994. He has a bachelor's in psychology and history from Miami University of Ohio, and earned both his master's and doctorate in experimental psychology from Ohio University. And he has a long resume of occupations that are fun and diverse, including a machinist, opera usher, entrepreneur, bus driver, DJ, mall Santa, publisher, fry cook, my favorite lead singer in a punk band.
Absolutely.
I can relate to that one. Researcher, financial planner, baseball umpire. But Dr. Hatala also has a book called Retrocausality and Psychology, or Psychology and Retrocausality, rather. And that's one of the reasons why I invited him on the show today. That's probably the theme we'll get into the most into this conversation. So welcome to the podcast. Thank you for taking time today. It's good to have you here.
Absolutely, Todd. I'm happy to be here.
So to begin, can you help the audience understand what the term retrocausality means and maybe how you explain your interest in that concept?
Absolutely. We tend to live in a causal universe. And so that's the way we think about things. And so philosophers of science refer to this as essentially paradigms or ways of thinking about the world. And so we think that the past is what determines the present and the future. And we see this in psychology too, because people like Freud believed that the best predictor of all neuroses, he believed, were caused by childhood trauma, if you will. And initially he thought it was child sexual trauma. And then he realized that basically all kids go through like Oedipal conflict or Electra, although that's from Carl Jung, who was a student of his. But the point being that it's the past that determines the present and future. Or another example from psychology, because that's my background, is somebody like B.F. Skinner, who's the founder of the idea of operant conditioning. He says behavior is controlled by its consequences. And so you do something, and if it turns out good, then you do it more. If it turns out bad, you stop doing it. What psychology is very poor at explaining are things like that we call phenomenological change. So an example is a guy named Malcolm Little, who was literally a thief, a pimp, and drug dealer.
Oh, God.
And he goes to prison. He finds God, in this case, Allah, and he comes out and he never commits another crime, and he becomes a civil rights leader, who we know as Malcolm X. So what psychology would say is, and this is what the whole idea behind behaviorism, which was the dominant school in psychology for over 50 years, is that the best predictor of people's future behavior is their past behavior. But that doesn't seem to be true for if people are, and this is what interventions are all about too, is that people can change, and that's what's called a phenomenological change, where they see their life differently. What retrocausality is about is essentially, it's a term that comes from physics, but I think it applies to psychology and philosophy and living. But yeah, it's that rather than seeing it as a life as essentially determined by the past, that it's also the future that determines the present in important ways. And we can talk about some of those.
Yeah. And so what evidence has convinced you, or is convincing or intriguing to you, or what experiments stand out to you that test retrocausality? And how can we test retrocausality?
Well, there's a lot of charlatanism in it. So because a lot of people who, precognition, I'm not saying is charlatanism, but there's, for a long time, there were like channelers, if you remember those people who were like, they could be from the future and then they tell you what you should be doing.
Sure.
But as far as scientific studies, probably the most famous is a guy named Daryl Bem, who he's a social psychologist
at Cornell.
Yeah. And he came up with a lot of different theories of now I'm blanking on it, social something or another. It doesn't matter. But about a decade ago, he published an article called Feeling the Future, which was 9 different studies of retrocausality, where, and it's important to keep in mind here too, people aren't like seeing into some like general future. What the argument is, what they're doing is they're remembering something that's happening in the future. And so I don't know if you'd like me to talk about some of his studies, or
I would, because they're really fascinating. But before you do, so
Sure.
I think that there's a ontological problem with feeling in the future, because now that raised the question, what is the future?
Sure.
Would you interpret retrocausality as future is more like a phenomenon of a block universe, as maybe hinted at by Einstein? So it's actually existing already?
I don't believe in a block universe, because a
Uh-huh.
block universe is unchangeable. And I think what Einstein would say is that, and he did say this, I can't remember the physicist who died, and he wrote his wife a letter, and he said that physicists know that things like ideas of past, present, and future, that's just a stubbornly persistent illusion, that
Yeah.
really it's all the same thing. And I
Mm.
think that is what I believe. So, because the idea of a block universe is that, just to explain that in case your listeners don't know what that is that essentially you could think of it in terms of like coordinates in time, that right now I'm sitting in my house, you're sitting in your house, and time is the 4th dimension of that. And so because we're doing this right now, that is like sealed in time, that this is the superposition that I'm in right now, where I'm sitting here talking to you, and that's unchangeable. I don't know that that's true.
Well, then, okay, let's go into maybe one of the experiments that stands out to
Sure,
you for
absolutely.
them.
So I think the easiest to understand is a very simple task, because it's one that we run in cognitive psychology all the time, where you have a list of to be remembered words. Okay, so he gives this is students, he gives them 48 different words, and then they do a free recall of those. And the words fall in 4 different categories. So there's occupations, foods, animals, and I think clothing or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Then he gives 24 of those words a second time. Okay, so after they've done the free recall, and they have to classify the words. And so, and I guess I should say too, like, so when so if the word is cow, when they originally get the word, they're told to create a visual image of it. And so like a cow eating grass, or a cow getting milked, or something along those lines. Then they do the classification test. So you get half of those words a second time that were on the original to be remembered list. So you get 24 words the second time, and you have to classify them. Is that a piece of clothing? Is that an animal, or whatever it is? What he finds is that the words that are on the second list are better recalled earlier in time. And so that's a retrocausal priming effect, that people, for whatever reason, are able to remember those words better. And so, yeah. And so that would be an example.
Yeah. And then there's another one that I think there's 2 curtains where students need to pick which one is hiding an image.
Right. And so, yeah, that's actually the first study that he does. The study that I just explained is what's called the White Queen study, because it's a lot of, I have a friend who's like, he says, once you get into Lewis Carroll, then you've lost me. But there's a line from Alice Through the Looking Glass, where she's talking to the White Queen, and the White Queen says that it's all about thinking backwards. And because Alice says, well, my memory only runs one way. I can only remember things that happened already. And the Queen says, well, that's not a very good system that only runs backwards. The study that you're talking about is, so here's the idea. I used to teach evolutionary psychology also, which I don't teach anymore for various reasons. But it is in our interest as animals, if you will, to recognize sexual situations. And so just for purposes of procreation, etc. So what he does is there's two curtains, and there's either an erotic photo or so people having sex, and they pre-test the people for what they like, so they get to see things that they like. So man, woman, woman, man, woman, whatever they're into. So there's no heteronormative bias to the study. And then there's also people just holding hands. Okay, so what he finds, so they have to decide which curtain is likely to have a picture. And what he finds is that people are much more likely, it's only 53%, so it's not a massive effect, but people are more likely to identify erotic photos than non-erotic photos, which are just—
And that makes sense because it has meaning from an evolutionary standpoint.
Exactly. That's his point. And they did a whole bunch of what's the word I want? Ways to control for things like not precognition, for like telekinesis, that the people weren't like determining where it was appearing on the screen. And so they did try to take ways to make sure that it was actually a retrocausal effect.
To rule out other types of psi phenomena.
Thank you, Todd. That's a better way to put it. But yeah.
But I'm curious that 53%, okay, it's not too statistically significant, but it is enough to override chance.
Absolutely. So my main issue with his research is that he's just testing undergraduates who don't care. They're just doing it for extra credit or something. And so if retrocausal sensitivity is something that's normally distributed, like every other characteristic in humanity, from height to weight to intelligence or anything else you want to
or even memory, right? Because some people have good memories. So if memory, like in Alice's analogy or story, could go both ways. Some people are good at remembering past. I'm not very good at remembering things. So yeah, I see what you're saying, that he's just sampling. It would be so interesting to take those who are actually seemingly sensitive to retrocausal
influence. Exactly. And so that's actually, I have another colleague, and that's what we're trying to develop tests to.
Oh, good. That's exciting.
Yeah. And then finding those people and creating a community of people who are retrocausally sensitive, and then see where we can go with that.
Well, I definitely want to stay in touch with you on that. And that could be also influencing our conversation.
That's 100% right. That's exactly right.
Now, why do you think, though, that the scientific community and the psychological community doesn't take that too seriously? Or why does it upset them? Do you have any feelings on that?
To just go back to BEM for a second, you would think that that these are important findings. And so he published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, which is an absolute top tier journal. Okay.
Totally legitimate. Yeah.
Completely. And so just to put it in context for you too, there was something called the replication crisis in psychology, where they tried to rerun a bunch of studies. And Journal of Personality and Social Psychology was one of the three journals that they reran the studies on. They reran 100 studies to see if they could still get the same levels of significance.
Who was doing this? Just an independent group?
It was a group of researchers. I can't remember the name of the person who headed it, but they did that. They did Journal of Experimental Psychology, Memory and Cognition, and Psychological Science. And what they found was, and I assure you, I'm not trying to just talk in a circle here, that the findings in social psychology were essentially the weakest. They were only able to replicate 21 or 26% of those studies. And the ones from cognitive psychology, like memory and learning and that sort of thing, was over half. And then in 2018, they did another series of studies with articles from, because Nature has a behavioral science version and Science, and they found a 61% replication rate. But BEM followed this up with other articles about it being his findings being replicated. And I wanted to say this too, that the editors of JPSP, before they published his Feeling the Future research, they put up essentially a disclaimer saying, look, we know that this is going to be controversial research, but we've gone over all of his statistics, all of his methodology, and we feel that this is important and should be published. But nobody does research on it. Few people with like university affiliations do, because the blowback is just too great. And so
it's unfortunate, though.
It really is. And so I think we think of like tenured professors. The whole idea behind tenure is being able to pursue anything you're interested in. But really, there's a very narrow range of things that you can study. My advisor in graduate school used to say, we never solve any problems, we just move on to different ones. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
And then another concern that arises for me with BEM studies, let's say it could be, it does meet the criteria of some kind of psi phenomena is the explanation, where you have a paradox then, because it retroactively demonstrates that the very protocols required for scientific study are inadequate. Because now you have blurred the boundary between what are classical notions of the constraints of interaction in space and time are, right? Which means you couldn't, then you could not prove that psi phenomena exists or something like retrocausality exists, which then leaves you with this infinite loop, right? And then the result is just, let's keep the scientific protocols as they are and avoid.
And let's not study this other thing.
Let's just not
the protocol. No, you're 100% right about that. And that's the ridiculousness of it. And so that's why, just to bring up some other things, like there's the area with the absolute most proof for it are things like precognitive dreams and things like end-of-life dreams and visions, which are different from deathbed type experiences. There's tons of data on this, but it really doesn't fit in a theoretical construct. And it absolutely doesn't fit in, I mean, psi is such a general term that in some ways I find it to be, that's why I prefer the term retrocausality, because it's describing a very specific phenomenon rather than, because psi is everything from like, you know, precognition to telekinesis, to prophecy, to you name it. And so,
but the main point though in that is there's still a violation of our classical notions, right? And that would challenge the paradigm of scientific protocols, which is important to know. I mean, so there are further implications of like the BEM.
I couldn't agree more. And you're absolutely right. So the criticisms of his research, people said that it essentially violated like the way the universe works, which is, I mean, they're starting from a point, and then if something doesn't fit what already is a part of their paradigm and what they believe is possible, then it can't actually happen. And that's a way for them to dismiss the findings.
Exactly. And then unfortunately, we just don't probe further to actually try to understand, well, what is the nature of the universe? What is the nature of consciousness? Some possibilities that come to my mind would be maybe consciousness is, or the way that we think about consciousness, is already a mystery, whether it's an emergent property or if it's more embedded into the space-time fabric. But maybe consciousness is an illusion, and therefore we have abstractions like past and future arising.
Absolutely. Right, because
but that would be worth knowing if that's the direction to go next, you know.
So I don't teach our class in consciousness. Another colleague does, but I teach cognitive science though, and so consciousness is a part of that too.
Right.
And so Marvin Minsky, who's a pretty famous computer scientist and AI researcher, he says conscious is nothing but short-term memory. So what Freud would refer to as the preconscious. So anything that you can think of is essentially what consciousness is. And then other people would argue that basically what consciousness is a narrative about what like what's Todd doing. So I don't know what Todd had for lunch, but it's like, well, why am I eating this? Well, this must be something I enjoy. And I've got a Zoom meeting with Mark at this time, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's a running narrative of what's called the zombie problem. Yeah, it's absolutely a mystery because things like sleep are a mystery. Yeah, so I don't know how far
Right, sleep itself is a paradox because on the one hand, we're paralyzed, and yet the brain is as active as it will ever
it is
be.
when it's awake. Exactly. Right. And so, so for example, I don't mean to keep on going back to Freud, but I think Freud's an important philosopher of the mind. So he sees dreaming as essentially wish fulfillment, where there's always part of our what's ever happening for that day, that's always part of it. And then again, there's both the manifest content, which is what the storyline of the dream, and then what the dream is actually about, the latent content, the underlying aspects of it. But there's other theories on dream interpretation too. And even within the psychoanalytic community, there's differences between like Freud and Carl Jung. So falling is a very common experience in dreams. And Freud interprets that as it's a fear of losing control. And because when you're falling, you can't have any effect over except for how you land, I guess. Whereas someone like Carl Jung interpreted that as proof of a collective unconscious, because when humans lived in trees, then falling was a very like upsetting and dangerous thing because you'd fall from a tree to the ground, something either breaks something or something eats you. And so even within the psychoanalytic community, they can't agree on what dreams mean. So,
well, collective unconscious, well, I think both of those psychologists made an important shift in the way that we think of ourselves. And that is there's a lot happening underneath the surface. And maybe the tip of the iceberg is what we consider to be conscious, or as you described, short-term recall. And that has massive implications. Now, I think most people, well, the collective unconsciousness, I think that along with maybe something like Aldous Huxley described when on mescaline, mind at large, could also have, could also maybe be possible ways to explain what feels like remote viewing, not remote viewing in the sense of psychic, but that we're not using the five senses in the traditional manner. And that I do like how Bem uses feeling the future because as the explanation, because it's like it's not the standard kind of epistemology. I think most people though can relate to precognitive dreams. If you ask almost anybody I've ever asked about this, they can recall at least one significant experience with a precognitive dream. It happens all the time in my family. I would say my dad would be a good candidate for your studies. He's often telling me about things before they happen from dream. And since we just had the anniversary of 9/11, my dad, in the days, maybe a week or so leading up to the tragedy, was having grief, sad, like intense sadness and grief. And he described it to me at the time. I'm like, what's going on? You okay? He's like, it's just the feeling you get when there is such a terrible tragedy. And then when it happened, it made sense retrocausally that he was feeling the future, as Ben described. He's also had dreams like Mark Twain's dream about his brother and all the details ahead of time. My father's had that too with his own grandfather, just days in advance or hours in advance.
If your listeners aren't familiar with it, wasn't it he dreamed that his brother would die in a steamboat explosion or something like that? And then
he got the details of the funeral down to the type of casket, which was metal. Some unusual details were there, and white flowers with one red rose in the center. And
So
And then
there's
he
a
was
lot of
just
documentation on this too. So there,
correct.
I think her name's Elizabeth Crone. So I don't know why so much of this has to do with plane crashes, but they do. She did she had a dream where a bunch of people were out on the wing of a plane, and she said it wasn't like United and it wasn't American, it wasn't like a major carrier. And then it was the when Sully landed the plane in the Hudson.
Okay.
And then she had another dream too, where she actually sent herself an email so it would be time stamped. She thought it was going to be an Asian airliner, and it was going to be that it was a prop plane, and that the wing ended up in front of it, but there were no casualties. And with 6 hours later, that exact same thing happened. And so the track record of this is absolutely incredible. But again, nobody does research on it because it really doesn't fit within any kind of theoretical framework.
So then what other possibilities could there be? Do you think there's something immaterial happening?
I think what's happening is because I don't think people are seeing a generalized future. And so this goes back to, if you're familiar with the term, what's called a done dream, which is, this is the guy, he wrote in the 1920s about studies with time where he had precognitive dreams. And what people remember are false details which appear in the paper. Okay. And so what that argues strongly for is people aren't like seeing into the future to see what's going to happen. What they're actually doing is they're remembering what they read in the future, and which is sometimes wrong. And so I think that gives more credence to it, because yes, they're getting the details wrong, but that's what people initially believe happened. And those done dreams are about things like volcanic eruptions, but there's also plane crashes and that sort of thing too.
In your book, you talk about how this may determine love. Do you mind sharing some examples?
So I teach romantic relationships too, and it goes to the idea, it explains what love at first sight is. And so I don't know how much detail you'd like me to go into on what love at first sight is, because they do research on that too. It's primarily men who experience love at first sight, because they think it's based on attraction. And so it's an instantaneous
physical attractiveness is more of a trait wired into men than to women.
Right.
And there's trust and a lot of other factors that go into. She's
pretty, so that she must be a good person, that right, sort of thing. But it's interesting because it's not a shared experience. And so a lot of times one person will feel it rather than both. But the retrocausal explanation for it is that essentially when you meet this person, you're remembering an entire future that you have together. And it just seems like, so the character—
But remembering it on a visceral level, so feeling.
Absolutely.
Feeling,
yeah,
even if it's not clear, even if you don't have the conscious details of the future.
You know that this person is significant and important and likely to be up for the rest of your life. And so it's, yeah. And so it gets into this, like I was saying earlier too, what you're remembering is a future that actually occurs. And so, yeah, the example I used in my book is my brother who proposed to his wife in kindergarten. He knew that that was the person that he was supposed to be with. They didn't get married in kindergarten, just to be clear.
But they reconnected.
She moved away in 5th grade. She turned him down. She said he was a stinkpot, her words, not mine. And then they saw each other on a bus when they were 18, and they've been together ever since. So he knew that they were supposed to be together. Yeah, and it's not like this is some modern phenomena. So the ancients had ideas about things like Cupid, where you just get hit by an arrow and you instantly fall in love with that person. And there's examples from the Bible too, where I can't remember exactly who it is, but the woman hops off the camel, Leah, and I think it was Jacob who says
Okay.
that's the woman's
Yes.
name. And so
Yeah.
that's first sight too.
I can tell you a story if you
Please.
don't mind about this. I have a friend about maybe 12, 13 years ago. We were hanging out and we heard a song on the radio that was pretty popular at the time. And she makes it a point to say how much this music impacts her. Not even so much that she likes the music, just that when she hears it, she feels as though she's at home.
Uh-huh.
And she would just always do that anytime it came up, or if I mentioned it, or it was on the TV or something like that. And eventually she decided to go to a concert of this artist because she just felt so magnetically drawn to it. And at the time, the band was performing at major fests. Their concerts were attended by like 50 to 100,000 people. And she was in one of these said concerts. And as soon as the lead singer saw her, it was love at first sight for him. She was already feeling like magnetically drawn to him and to the music.
Absolutely.
And he stopped. I talked to him later on, and he said,
Uh-huh.
in that moment, the world stopped. Basically, how people describe love at first sight. It's as if you could be in a crowded room of people, but the person's eyes, who you're in love with, and their face kind of shines out as separate, distinct from everyone else.
Right.
And he said he had to debate whether or not to just stop performing and make sure he could go meet her. But then he said, he collected himself, composed himself. I have to fulfill my obligation here. And then he proceeded to pursue her through the town and the venue afterwards, after they finished the concert. Couldn't find her. Made a post on social media looking for her.
Uh-huh.
She had a flag that she made for the band. And so he wrote something about that. There was somebody with this poster or flag, and she responded, and they got together and had a family. So
that's amazing.
yeah,
That
especially when you consider all of the people that he was interacting with that year. I mean, thousands, maybe millions.
Yeah.
And she knew, and he knew the very first time he saw her in a massive crowd. That was an example of where I was like, I have to really think about this. It got me starting to approach life retrocausally, meaning there's a lot we can accept about ourselves when we consider what we don't know right now about our future, feelings that we have, insecurities that we have, especially when they seem totally irrational. It's one thing when we have symptoms of like PTSD after trauma.
Sure.
It's another thing when there might be some irrational fears or concerns and we can't connect it to anything in the past. Maybe there's something wired into our DNA from our ancestors, but maybe it says something also about what's going to happen.
I agree, 100%. I want to go back just one last time to the love at first sight.
Yes, please.
They're hearing about that. Is one of the other things they find, and that's why I'd be curious if this happened with your friend too, is that there's a level of familiarity with that person where it's not like you're meeting them for the first time. It's like being reunited with that person. Yeah. And it's more like a friend that you haven't talked to in a long time than it is like you're meeting a stranger and that you want to know everything about them. And so it sounds like that's precisely what happened to your friend.
That may also be true even in other types of loving connections. Like I can think of friends that became great friends. And if I recall our first meeting, there was something familiar. It was like meeting an old friend. So I think, yeah, this seems to play out when there's meaningful connections of any kind. This just reminded me of another love story. I had a colleague at a hospital that I work at that would look at a photograph that was just the art that the employer put in the room of it was a photographic image of Lake Louise, which I think is in Banff, Alberta, Canada. She didn't know where that was. I didn't know where it was. It was just a beautiful photo of the lake. And she would just stand there sometimes and look at it for extended periods of time. And I'm like, you really like that image. Maybe you can visit that place someday. She's like, I don't know. It's just when I see it, I feel something familiar. And one day her boyfriend planned a surprise trip for them. he told her, we need to take these few days off. Actually, he didn't even tell her that. He arranged with our employer for her to have that time off. Just picked her up one day, bags packed, and said, I'd like to take a trip with you. And she's like, well, I got to work. He's like, no, it's all taken care of and everything. The surprise destination was Banff. He proposed to her at Lake Louise. And when it all unfolded, it was like, this is why I was retrocausally, she understood why she would always look at the photograph of Lake Louise, because in the future, she was going to be having one of the most life-changing experiences. So yeah, so
and yet
there are some pretty compelling examples.
And yet no one, this is a common, I mean, it's not common, but we can both come up with multiple different
but
examples.
Some episode is pretty common, at least, one story people can probably recall. Right.
And yet we don't study these things, and it's just written off as coincidence or yeah. So,
and it just seems like coincidence cannot explain some of these. I think if it was more vague or something, but thank God you're a tenured professor.
No. Well, yeah, I mean,
and interested.
Most of my published research is because my background's in decision making and memory. And so that's not really essentially how I got into this. But yeah, so all my research that got me tenure is incredibly boring. So it's essentially about mate selection, but that's why I'm interested in it from that perspective. If you want to talk about learning or intelligence or any of those other things.
And I'll tell you one other quick story about learning, and then we can segue into your take on it. When I was an undergraduate, I shifted after my first year from the School of Business to psychology, to the College of Arts and Sciences. And I picked the hardest class because it was with a visiting professor, Dr. Prebram, who was old. He was maybe near 80 years old at the time. He was visiting. He was a renowned neurosurgeon. But the course was like a 900 level cognitive science course. And this was going to be my first class in psychology. But I think I was feeling something from the future. And I remember going into the seminar on the first day, and I sat down feeling a little intimidated. I was seeing older students go in and maybe even a few clinicians from the community. Sure. So I got intimidated, and I sat down and I opened one of his books, Brain and Perception. And I just read one sentence, jumped off the page. I read that and decided I don't want to read anything else. It said, the neuron is the basic unit of computation in the brain. I closed the book and I went in, and then Dr. Prebram came up to me and he said, if you're Todd, I have to resolve an issue with you. Back then, this was late 90s. We registered for classes analog style. We mailed something in, and so I maybe was able to slip through the cracks, not meeting prerequisites. But he said, you don't have the prerequisites. You don't have Psych 101 or a biology course. So he's like, I just don't think this is going to be worth it for you. I said, well, that may be, but I'm not really interested in the grade. You're a visiting professor. Right. You have knowledge. Maybe I won't understand it today, but I think it will be a valuable experience for me. He liked that, but he still had this problem with the registrar. So he stepped back for a moment, started scratching his long white beard, and then a light bulb went off in his face, and he stepped forward and he said, I'll tell you what, if you can tell me the definition of a neuron, I'll let you take this course. I'll make the case for you with the university. And so I puffed my chest up and tell the only thing I know about the brain at the time. But this was a case, now looking back, of a more immediate retrocausal phenomenon, because I needed it to happen. And at the same time, that sentence jumped off the page because a few moments later, he was going to be asking me about that. Now I was just looking at pages and why the other things didn't resonate with me. It's impossible to explain by mere coincidence, I feel. So, well,
I could give you something else that they look at, because again, these aren't necessarily life or death experiences.
Right.
There's a lot of examples for people who've been in combat where they feel like they don't like the position they're in, so they move, and then something blows up right where they just were. So again, it's not the life or death that you're talking. I mean, you're not talking about a life or death situation, but there's innumerable wartime examples of
Oh,
things
that's
like
interesting.
that. And so the counter to that, though, is we don't hear from the people who moved to a new position and then got blown up either, and so who made the wrong choice. But there definitely seems to be this, if you believe in
But at the same time, let me just add one thing there before you continue, that if we needed to remember something from the past and it was life or death, our memories still may fail us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I was just going to say that we seem to be wired for this essentially remembering a future where you're alive, if you will. And so it's just issues with past and future. Because one of the things I wrote about too is things like depression, where we used to believe that depression is caused by, essentially, like I said earlier, with Freud, bad things happening in the past, and that determines depression now. And Martin Seligman, who's he's been president of the American Psychological Association. He's a huge researcher. He's part of this Homo prospectus movement now, is that people seem to be much more oriented towards the future. And so, like, when they ping people during the day, they're not thinking about the past, they're thinking about the future. And so, yeah, the way retrocausal,
3 times more likely, I think
3 times more likely to be thinking about
That's
the future,
fascinating.
or making plans for the future. So that's why in things like positive psychology, it's instead of looking at it from a medical model of there's something wrong and we need to fix it, it looks at, like, what makes people happy, and then how can other people live their lives that way. And so it's things like having a planner, making the future seem knowable, is really important for people.
In, like, Beck's cognitive triad of depression, you have negative feelings about oneself, the world, and then, most importantly, for the retrocausal explanation, the future.
Sure.
And as you're saying, we classically think of depression as more of a rumination about the past.
Right. That's 100% correct. And
However,
women are more likely to ruminate than men are, and so that's been used as an explanation for why women are more likely to be diagnosed with clinical depression.
And so, if there's a real negative event in the future, I mean, there are negative events in the future that are inevitable: dying, loss, and I don't know if it was you who said it in your book, but it requires a certain amount of self-deception to have only positive sentiments about the future, to be only optimistic.
Well, mental health is having an unrealistic and optimistic view of how the world is going to go. So no, what Seligman calls it, because people who are depressed have very negative views about how they think the future is going to go.
Correct.
So it's dysfunctional perspection is the technical term for it. That they think that, like, so for example, I have students who are giving presentations, and they're always thinking about how awful it's going to be, and they're going to say something wrong, and everybody's going to laugh, or who knows what. But public speaking is a huge issue for a lot of people. But what depressed people do is, or people who are clinically depressed, is all they see are the negative outcomes, and they don't feel that there's anything they can do about it. And so that leads to a sense of helplessness. But it's 2 other researchers there, I'm blanking on their names too, but they came up with the idea of what's called depressive realism in the 1970s, that says that and there's a lot of proof for this too, that depressed people are actually much more in tune with reality, that the rest of us essentially have a bright and cheery view of what's happening and what's going to happen in the future.
I've noticed that too, especially when I work with adolescents in psychiatric care. In conversations, more detailed conversations, you can really walk away feeling like they just have a much more accurate view of reality, and they're feeling that, and the empathy for some of those truths is heavy.
Of course.
And what sometimes I feel we're asking of them is to neglect or overlook or deceive oneself, as you put it. So I guess this really raises questions about what would be a better intervention for something like depression. I think taking into account those real sentiments about the future, but understanding maybe that happiness is overrated, and there can be, let's take a funeral, for instance. People probably aren't happy, but that doesn't mean everybody is miserable either. There could be humor happening, there could be gratitude, there could be a lot of other things. So there may be ways, more realistic ways to reframe cognition for clients and for patients with depression, taking into account those realities of the future.
Well, if not, this isn't to change the subject. I assure you this is on the same thing.
Okay.
Psychology changes every 30 years. So what we believe to be true, it's constantly changing. And so there's a psychological joke about this, if I can share it.
Yeah,
I'll make it about me, but it could be anybody, because I've been teaching at the college level for 33 years now. Father comes up, who's a former student, and he says, my daughter is in your class, and I looked over her test, and I see that you're still asking the exact same questions. And I respond, yeah, but now all the answers are different. That psychology it constantly changes. And so you had mentioned PTSD earlier, and there was a big movement probably within the last decade, because I'm really into VR and as a therapeutic technique, but with veterans, where they would essentially relive their trauma and get control of it, and that was a way of coping and a therapeutic technique that they were trying out. Now they believe that's actually a very poor way to do it, because what it does is it's natural forgetting. So back in the Civil War, it was just like forget about the bad times that occurred, and that through natural forgetting, you're not reliving it and you're not having intrusive thoughts about it. Because, and now I'm getting way far afield. I'm sorry. This all ties together in my own mind, but perhaps not in discussing it. Is going back to Freud again, where he believed that memories were repressed. But Elizabeth Loftus, who studies things like eyewitness testimony, studying children who've seen their parents killed or raped in front of them, the problem isn't that they repress that information. The problem is that it's intrusive, that they think about it all the time. And so it's I guess my point being, we're always changing both therapeutic techniques and psychology and the way we conceive of what the problems are.
Thank you for clarifying that. And so maybe we can shift and head towards a conclusion with how to maybe tap into this, or what have you learned from your research that could be helpful on a day-to-day level for people?
Wow, that's really a good question, and that's what I'm trying to figure out. So what I do with so I write two kinds of books. Okay, I write books on writing, which sell very well. That's essentially how I make my living. I just bank my academic salary and I live off my writing. And I write books on time travel, which don't sell at all, because the way, then this is how I came to retrocausality, is one of the things that we talk about in psychology. So there's a psychological test that you can take. You can't take it online. It's the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI. Okay, so it's been around since the 1950s. It's used for diagnosing things like schizophrenia and major depression, you name it. Okay, and it's got a lot of questions that it's all yes, no. It's like 400 questions, but it's like if you were, it has validation questions. So questions like, are you afraid of spiders? So Todd, I'll ask you, are you afraid of spiders?
No.
Okay. So if you're trying to answer in such a way, like to try to trick the test to thinking that you're schizophrenic, how do you answer that question? Are schizophrenics more afraid of spiders, less afraid of spiders. It's a pattern of answers, okay? But the theory is that if you can think like someone who is schizophrenic, then you're probably schizophrenic yourself. And so there's no way to emulate it, if you will, that it's a way of thinking. It's a way of approaching the world. So to go all the way back around, I think that we are all, I don't want to say victims, we're all trapped in a particular time period that we're in, and that people think very differently in other cultures and at different times, and being able to tap into that. And so the books that I write that don't sell, I'm not writing fictional time travel stories. What I do is I replicate entire days from the past. And so I've got a book from 1972, which is the last, December 7th, 1972, which is the last Apollo mission when we went to the moon. And so it's everything from morning newspapers, all the magazines that were there that day, all the television that was on that day. And then I've written another one on February 9th, 1964, which is when the Beatles were on that Sullivan show. And then the one I'm working on now is on December 1st, 1955, which is when Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. But December 7th, 1941, Depression, Wall Street crash, all those kinds of things. And so it's a way of trying to understand the way people in that time understood their world. And if I give you one more example, I watched a movie over this past weekend called Great Freedom Number 7. You can find it on YouTube. It's a movie that was made in Nazi Germany in 1944 in color with all their biggest stars. It wasn't shown in Germany until 1946, though. Goebbels refused to show it. There's no Nazi propaganda. There's no swastikas. There's nothing like that in it. But what it gives you is an insight into a familiar but entirely different world. And so it gets into the quote of the past is a foreign country, and trying to understand it. And so I think it's when you get into the paradoxes of things like time travel, it's not that we change the past. Time travel is really about changing the present. That's what people want to do. But I think one of the things is that it really changes you. And the other thing is, I think if you want to go forward, you have to go back. That's another one of the paradoxes of it.
Maybe the present is like the middle of a space-time popsicle stick, and it's getting
I don't even know if it's that. And that's the thing, is that because as you sit here today too, it's the influences of the past, present, and future are all taking place in you simultaneously. And so it's this issue that physicists talk about too, the whole idea of simultaneity. If there is such a thing where there's one moment in the entire universe, and I think that's what we think of as the present. But to go back to the original Einstein quote, physicists know that there really is no difference between the past, present, and future.
And maybe our language complicates our perception of this, like in the movie
100%.
Arrival. I don't know if you've ever seen that.
The movie Arrival, that is the movie on retrocausality. That's the best movie on that.
Yeah, I would encourage people to see that listening to this if you haven't. Yeah. And you've talked about the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, where civilizations that maybe didn't have the kind of language for different time periods perhaps experience time differently, or experience the present.
That's what Benjamin Whorf believed in the 1930s. He was studying the Hopi Indians, and they don't have terms for past and future. And so he said that they were incapable of thinking about that. And so he developed what's called the linguistic relativity hypothesis, which is a fancy way of saying that words that we have are concepts that we are valuable in our culture have a lot of words for them, and things that aren't. So what I do in my cognitive class is I go through the entire class and have everybody give a euphemism for money. Everybody can come up with a unique term about money, bread, dead presidents, whatever it is, because that's important in our culture. But and it goes back to the whole Inuit idea that they have however many different terms for different types of snow. So there's snow that's good for making igloos. There's some snow that's good for packing or whatever it is. And so, yeah. And so we're really bound by these ways of thinking, by our culture. That's why one of the reasons I'm happy I teach at a liberal arts college. I'm sure that you're happy that you have a liberal arts education instead of a business education, for heaven's sakes. I always tell my students too, the mistakes that you make out of love, that's the reason to make mistakes. Doing it for money or because it's what you think your parents want or anything else, you can always justify. You're making the right choice if you're making it out of love or because you think you're helping people.
And I think that, that's a good place to take this, because people really struggle with decisions. People struggle with seeming mistakes. Did I make the wrong decision? And I think this could be applied in the immediate future, when we just have these like little inconveniences. If you just step back for a moment and take into account the future, you might have a different feeling about it. And it might just create a different type of attitude towards your life and a different relationship between you and problems. So much of what we even consider to be a problem has to do with what we tell ourselves about the problem. I've experimented with this in just very simple ways, like getting delayed on the road. I just simply asked myself, could this have any meaning in the future? And sure enough, one time when I did that, I was delayed, or I took a wrong exit heading into Chicago, and I was delayed an hour going to the restaurant I was going to. But when I arrived, a friend that I met randomly there arrived at the same time, who I would have never saw or never caught up with if I didn't make my mistake.
Right.
So there are just little things like that people may notice. And anytime I do this, I find that there's a certain kind of openness that comes to me, and a certain freedom and receptivity to life, which, leads me to another point that you mentioned something about theta waves.
They made a documentary called Lucky, which is about people, because usually what you hear about is people who win the lottery, like blow it all on, they blow half of it on, prostitutes and drugs, and then they waste the other half, but this looked at people who basically didn't have bad outcomes from it. And so this was a guy who, I can't remember his name, but it's in the book. But he was a PhD in math, and theta waves are essentially when you're daydreaming. So like there's something called road hypnosis, like where you're driving your car and then you're like, oh my God, 20 minutes have passed and I didn't realize what was happening.
Yeah.
But it's that kind of daydreaming. A lot of times it happens in the shower. If you're a runner, a lot of times it happens when you're running, if you're not listening to music. You just open yourself up to this, essentially to daydreaming, to that sort of thing. So anyway, he trained himself to put himself where he could daydream like that. And he just wrote down numbers as they came to him. And he started playing them every day. 2.5 years later, he hit 50 million. And he just liked to fantasize about what it was going to be like to win the lottery. I'm not advocating winning the lottery because I don't think money makes a difference in anybody's life, except negatively, if that's the way they want it to be. But he knew what the numbers were going to be. He just didn't know when they would hit. And so he kept on playing them for 2.5 years. So that ties back to what we were talking about before. He's not seeing some future. He's remembering something from the future. So he's remembering something that actually happens in the future.
And his memory is a little fuzzy, which is why he doesn't know exactly when to play.
He doesn't know when it's going to hit, but he knows.
Why it was smart to just play it continuously until it hits.
Exactly.
And that kind of theta wave state is a little different than like meditation. You are actually thinking. There's a lot more cognition happening, but it's in this sort of
a lot more intentional than what you would find in meditation. But I'm a big fan of meditation too, so I'm not going to in any way
same
that.
Yeah, I try to meditate every day, and I think that what I like about meditation is I think it does also alter my perception of time, because in a meditative state, you feel less confined by locality in space and time. Maybe maybe like we were saying before, the stubborn illusion of past, present, future has to do with the flow of thoughts, and maybe the thinker is another thought. So meditation gives us a lot of relief from those recurring themes and stories.
Agreed. Yeah.
Well, this has been excellent. I'm really excited
Me
about
too.
your future research and learning more about how that influenced this present conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I hope we can connect again and talk about that, and have you share more with what you're discovering on that front. But is there anything you'd like to share with the audience, anyone who might be listening that's not familiar with your work, so that they can find either your books or
Oh,
your research?
yeah. It's yeah. I have a lot of videos on YouTube,
Okay.
both on everything in psychology, but on retrocausality, on time travel, on all those kinds of things. So yeah, believe it or not, yeah, I don't put the time travel stuff on my resume. I just put the books that I write on writing. That's what goes on there. But
Okay.
yeah, no, this has
Well,
been a lot of fun for me too, Todd. I appreciate
I really appreciate your time, and I applaud the courage that you have to just pursue what's out there. Follow the trail of truth.
Thank
So,
you. There's nothing else that I can do. This is what I'm intended to do. So
all right, thank you so much, and we wish you all the best
thank
with
you.
this school year. Thank you, Dr. Hatala.